Good afternoon. Good. I am Kendra Edwards, a licensed master social worker and a certified grief recovery method specialist. I am currently working in the Department of Prevention and Wellness with Northeast Delta Human Services Authority. As an employee with Northeast Delta, we as a staff must make sure that providing services and recognizing the issues throughout Northeast Delta is what we're to do. Making sure those individuals that have mental health, developmental disabilities, and addictive disorders are functioning at their best. We as a staff is also making sure that we are concerned with the quality of care for all individuals and making sure the availability of the services needed is provided throughout the community. We also, as a staff, are making sure we are meeting the standards and making sure the knowledge and skills that we provide are updated on a regular basis. My topic for today's presentation is bridging the gaps of grief and loss in recovery. I would like to say once again, welcome. It is my pleasure to stand before you, not only as a grief counselor, but as a professional, to make sure that I provide the information for you that you would take away, not as only a professional, but as an individual who has a family member who has been affected by grief in such a way. It is my job as a grief recovery specialist to make sure that you walk away with the information that you need on today, that you may incorporate in your practice, send back to your centers, so that everyone could be on one accord. Today, I would like to highlight just a few objectives to give you a better understanding of grief from a different perspective, the role of grief and loss in recovery, stigma associated with grief, and explain to you the method used in the LaSOR program. But before we get started, here's a little short video I would like to play for you. This just gives you a general understanding of what individuals talk about and what they grieve in the beginning before starting the grief recovery method.
I lost who I was in my addiction. I'm existing, not living. I just want to be heard. I let others down, including myself. I couldn't cope with looking in the mirror. I self-medicate because I don't know how to deal with my pain. It hurts me that I couldn't say goodbye. I grieve because I can't connect with my children. It's hard to forgive myself for all that I've done. I love my children, but I love my drugs more. I'm grieving because I can't put the needle in my arm. Does that make sense to you?
Wow, that video is powerful. That gives you a general understanding of what are some of the grievers talking about, especially when they're with me individually or in a group setting. They're dealing with a lot of heavy weight. Could you agree? Let's begin. Grief is a conversation that we should have, and a series of conversations that should be continued. A topic that should not be ignored or pushed aside. Why? Because grief is very present in our lives. We have seen since the beginning of the pandemic, and even now, how grief and loss has impacted our lives in such a way. How our social activities have decreased. The isolations from everyday enjoyment has caused so much mental, physical, and emotional devastations. We have seen the overwhelming increases of healthcare concerns, job losses, homelessness, deaths due to COVID, and deaths due to drug overdoses. Since this opioid epidemic is on the rise, we have seen those numbers increased all over America. We have seen how those numbers increased here in our very own state of Louisiana. And we're continuing to see those numbers increase here in our very own region. So grief is what? At an all-time high. We as professionals must know what grief looks like, and the populations that we serve, how they understand and know what grief looks like for them. Most often, individuals identify grief as emotions, sadness, hurt, pain, mourning, and so forth. Some people identify grief as death, because the first time you ask them, what do you think about grief, or what do you think grief is, they think death. I would say, as a grief facilitator, those that enter into my groups, they are a little hesitant to come in, because the first thing they say, I haven't lost anybody due to a death. And my response is, you're in the right group. When we learn to identify and understand what grief really is, and the losses that these individuals are impacted with, we can begin to make a change. And as we discuss these concerns in our groups, the individuals begin to cry, and true breakthrough is at hand. Now you see how this has impacted just individuals and how it has impacted the world. You just imagine how grief is going to be a continued impact for us all. Right? So in this room on today, if you were to look around of each and every one of us, all of us in this room has a unique experience with grief and loss, and possibly even trauma. Let's take a look at the lists of those losses. Loss of identity. This is one of the most common losses that individuals face with substance abuse. Giving up who they are. Am I willing to examine that? Am I willing to give up the past for me to move on to the future? The hopes, the dreams, and the expectations. You think about those individuals who are impacted by substance abuse and addiction, how their hopes and dreams are shattered because of grief. You think about how their self-esteem is impacted in such a way. Now let's take a look at the loss of relationships. That is the second common one. The loss of relationships with substances. Because most often individuals don't want to give up the substance. They struggle and battle with the highs and the lows of their substance abuse. Should I give it up? Should I move on? And family. The relationships that has been impacted by children. How the families have lost their children to custody battle due to their substance abuse. How they have lost communications with their loved ones due to their substance abuse and addiction. You imagine the weight of what that carries. And those friends that they use with, they can no longer use with them anymore, because either they done passed away, they have to think about making a change, or they inside recovery. So you think about these losses that are identified. These are most losses that we, myself, and the group identify together, because it's about them that's making the change. And when you think about the one loss, how one loss can impact another, the loss of a job can impact a home. The loss of a home can impact the finances. And it all begins to trickle down. So you imagine one loss can trickle to another loss and another loss. The weight of grief is very strong. You agree? And through the grief process, we often do identify those common responses. Confusion. Because oftentimes individuals who have grief, they have confusion. They may end up in one room and not sure why they're there, have difficulty with sleeping habits because of the grief is overpowering them. And then you look at the eating habits. The same thing applies, overeating or not eating enough. Now imagine that just along with grief. Then you add more to it with someone with substance abuse, how that impacts it both. That's a lot of weight. And the difficulty in completing those activities and those tasks, they have difficulty with that because they're so consumed with grief. And I always say the most common of the common is isolation. Usually those who have a history of substance abuse, they isolate themselves foremost, especially when they're coming out of these rehabs, because they don't have the people, the attention and the environment that they're returning back to is not going to be the same. So that's just along with substance abuse. Now let's add grief to it. They begin to isolate themselves because of the challenges that they're dealing with. That becomes that more impactful. And also numbness. People often numb how they feel, and we'll talk about that later. And the other emotions that you see here is anger, guilt, regret, sadness, and depression. These are the most common ones, but there are several other emotions that we can identify. They could be one emotion at a time, and oftentimes they can be a whole bunch of emotions experienced at one time. That's what makes it overwhelming. Now we're down to the 6 common myths in grief. When we talk about the myths, sometimes it's become a little touchy subject, but we have to talk about it because we have to address these matters. When you think about an individual who has those sad, negative, and painful emotions, oftentimes they're told, don't feel bad. Usually this can start as a child on up into adulthood. You imagine as a child being bullied in the neighborhood, and you come home and tell your mom, Mom, I'm sad, I'm upset how these children are bullying me. And what mom tells you to do? Second one, replace the loss. Go get you a cookie. Go watch your favorite TV show. Go play with your favorite toy. But Mom, I'm hurting. Mom, that really impacted me in such a way. So we learn early on that loss can be replaced. But I'm hurting. Now I'm growing over into my teenage years and into my adult years. And when I'm struggling with these losses as an adult, what do? I begin to replace those losses with what? Substances. Wow. It can start that early on. Now, Mom then told me all these things that I feel. She told me number 3 is to what? Grieve alone. That's a form of isolation. And there's a parable that says we laugh, the world laughs with us. When we cry alone. So we're taught early on these things, but nothing to do with the feelings. It's just what we call intellectual comments. And of those, the most common is just give it time. We hear that all the time, right? And to go alongside that is time heal all wounds. And it's almost as if you want to ask a question behind that. What do you mean? What do I do? Because now I have lost my loved one 20 years ago and you telling me to just give it time? Give it time to do what? It's the skills that we learn in time to help us heal the broken hearts that we have. It's the willingness and attentiveness that we have to give it time. So when over time we can see ourselves progressing and moving forward beyond the loss. And another one is be strong for others. That's one they always tell us to pretty much mask up how you look, right? I'm fine about the situation. Don't cry about it. That's what being strong look like for others. So pretty much don't show your emotions, hide those emotions. So you imagine all the hurt people that walks around doing just that, being strong for others. Then you think about the children that are involved in this situation, that's impacted by this. They're taught the same thing, be strong for others. Wow. The challenges and the barriers is something that we should be aware of. Accepting the reality of the loss. Denying the fact that the loss has not taken place. And oftentimes that one is very challenging because a lot of people can't move forward because they haven't came to a place of acceptance. But I always say don't rush that process. Things do have to be sorted out through the process of acceptance. And that's where we as counselors have to dig deeper to help these individuals understand and able to feel those emotions that's necessary. And when they have those difficulties, are you willing to work through the pain? And moving beyond the loss, the readjustments that comes with that. I have lost my children due to the custody. Am I willing to move on? I have lost my friend due to a drug overdose. Am I willing to move on? I have lost the love of my life. Am I willing to move on? I have lost who I was through this process. Am I ready to move on? What does the new normal looks like? That's oftentimes a struggle because people fear of what the new normal could look like. Looking at the old versus the new habits. That's very important. They say you can't move forward unless you look at the old, right? And oftentimes people don't want to look at the old because sometimes they want to pinch off the old going into the new. But we have to be willing to give up all of the old to move to the new. That's how we can be completely changed and completely whole. We can't be whole half-stepping, right? And we have to be able to teach the individuals that they can't be whole half-stepping. It all plays in the new normal. So when identifying the role that loss plays in the recovery process, we as the professionals must be willing to look at the recovery aspects as a whole. So if I was to have a circle, or draw a circle, inside of this circle there are 6 components that are included. And one of those components consists of grief. We as the professionals should not overlook grief. Because there are a large number of individuals that are entering into these treatment settings and they reporting a loss. The more you continue to assess, they reporting multiple losses. And as they're going on through the recovery process, you begin to identify some of those losses that we stated earlier when they were in their active periods of addiction. Wow. So an approach is needed, and it must be a right approach to make sure that these individuals are successful in the recovery process. Because we as professionals just don't want to look at just the substance abuse side of things and the addiction side of things, but we want to help the individual to work through their grief. So that's what makes it whole. We don't want to leave out anything because we want to make sure the people that leaves us on a day-to-day basis, leave us from our groups and discharge back into society, that they feel somewhat whole. That they're able to move forward and make it through this world, even when grief is present. Other aspects on how grief shows up in the recovery, we must be able to identify What are the other losses that's taking place? Who the person once was and aspired to be? Because oftentimes when there's years of addiction that's on the scene, they have lost who they were. Are we willing to pick up the pieces? Is the individual willing to pick up the pieces? So we can get back to a place of inspiration, so that they can redefine and rebuild who they were and who they are. I always say in a relationship, you define and redefine who you are. Just like in those relationships with that substance abuse, you define and redefine who you are. And also, we have to be conscious as professionals. The loss of a loved one while in recovery, that impacts it even more. Now, I'm dealing with the challenges that I have. Now, I've lost my friend due to a drug overdose. I have gotten a phone call that my family member has died while I'm going through the recovery process. That makes me urge to want to use again. See, we have to look at all those dynamics when we assess the individual. Because when they're in groups with me, they pour it all out. And we must be willing to take the steps that's necessary so that the individual can move beyond the loss. Faith is a most common one. Individuals have lost their faith along the way. They have lost the disconnection between their relationship and consider their higher power. So what can we do to bring them back to a place where that can be included in the recovery aspect, if that's what they choose? Because faith plays a big important role in each and every one of our lives. And how can we help bridge that? In the process of forgiveness, am I willing to forgive me? Am I willing to forgive you? And oftentimes that's a touchy word because people don't want to talk about forgiveness. I'm not ready yet. And that's understandable because it is a process that we need to go through. And I always tell them I'm not coming in here to sell forgiveness or force forgiveness, but it should be included in your recovery process because it helps you heal and it helps you grow so that you can move beyond the loss. So the connection between the two, we must make sure we identify what that connection is. How people use substance to numb. Because oftentimes people don't have coping mechanisms put in place. They don't have the resources that they need. They can't tolerate the emotional pain. So what do? They numb it. They hide it with what? Substances. Wow. And these behaviors can be on a consistent basis, or it can be a first-time problem, or using the substance. Those who have substance use disorders, it becomes worse. And if the goal is to heal, they must be willing to go through the process, be attentive to go through the healing process. And these three things that's listed is therapy, support groups, and recovery centers going to help them work through the healing process. Addressing stigma. There is so much stigma surrounded or associated with grief and loss. We must first be willing, we as a professionals must first be willing to address the challenges and the barriers that these individuals are facing. Because they are reporting some underlying issues and some hidden fears. But the negative perceptions and the attitudes that stigma has left these individuals isolated when they're broken. Wow. Ashamed of who they are. Trapped in their own emotions. Afraid to face loss after loss after loss. And good old stigma, I call it old stigma, has impacted the families in such a way and kept the families so silent that they can't even seek help. And those individuals who have lost their loved ones due to addiction, what does society do? They stigmatize them even the more, making them feel misunderstood and that the resources are very limited. So you imagine the hurt and the pain that these people are feeling. And as a result, it becomes to anger, anger, isolation, isolation, then shame. Wow. So what are we doing to help bridge this gap? In my closing, we must consider that a bridge is a structure that is supported by cables and quality material and a strong foundation. Let's compare the individual's life similar, because support is needed on an ongoing basis, either from the family member, the friends, the community, the professionals, the list goes on. So what are we doing? What is the individual doing? There is 100% that's needed for the individual, and not only for the individual, but us as the professionals, so we can help bridge this gap. And if we can't bridge, we got to learn to pass the torch so that the ball won't get dropped. Because these individuals are walking hurt, just like each and every one of us in here sitting in this room probably carrying weight that haven't shared with their neighbor. So you imagine the impact, the weight that grief carries. And I want to leave with you as a quote. But before I leave that quote, there's another video I want to show you. And before this video, I'll go back to the video and how this method is used. I use this method with individuals and in a group setting. This method is used from all ages, okay? So there's no discrimination when it comes to the age on which this population consists of. And with this method, we go through the loss graph, the relationship graph, and we say goodbye to the losses that they have. Wow. This last video, I'm ready.
It's good to know that I'm not alone. I'm glad I can talk about my feelings. I know now that there is hope. I'm open to forgive myself. It's good to know that it's okay to feel sad from time to time. One of the hardest things was learning that I was worth recovery. I learned a lot about grief and myself. I learned tools that I can apply in my relationships. I was hiding my grief for years, but I'm glad I was able to talk about it. I see grief from a different perspective.
So in the beginning, you saw the video on those that were entering to those treatment settings. This is the very end of those who have gone through. So you can imagine the tone and how things have changed once you see the progress that's being made. So what I want to leave with you, overcoming grief. This is from the grief recovery method. Overcoming grief. We should not go over it, under it, around it, but we must be willing to go through it. So I can't be reached. I'm sorry it ain't on the screen anymore, but at Department of Prevention and Wellness. So if you need my contact information, I'm here to the very end, and you're more than welcome to stop and talk to me or give me an email, and I'll be more than welcome to answer your questions. Thank you. I'm so sorry. I am so sorry.
Great job. Great job.